What if I told you that everything you think you know about Princess Diana's family is a lie? We all know the fairy tale version. The shy, doe-eyed girl who became a princess. The style icon who defined a generation. Everyone points to the Spencers, her aristocratic family, wealthy, respectable, polished. But that's only the story we're meant to believe. Hidden beneath the name Spencer lies another story. A darker story. A story dripping with blood, betrayal, and forbidden love. A story erased from the official record but alive in the veins of Diana herself. The name you need to remember isn't Spencer. It's Tudor. Yes, that Tudor. The dynasty of Henry Roman VIII, the dynasty of beheaded queens, of shattered vows, of one of the bloodiest reigns in English history. You're probably thinking that's impossible. After all, history insists the Tudor line ended with Queen Elizabeth I. And officially, that's true. But official history often hides the truth. And so, if you thought the Tudor story was over, let's reopen it. Our tale doesn't begin in a golden palace or a crowded coronation hall. It begins in the shadows with a woman history tried to erase. Her name was Mary Tudor, not Bloody Mary, the Queen, but another Mary, Henry Roman VIII's younger sister. She was known across Europe for her beauty, with fiery red gold hair and eyes that could soften or burn with equal intensity. Henry adored her. He called her his pearl. But pearls, no matter how beautiful, can be locked away. In 1514, for political gain, Henry arranged for his 18-year-old sister to marry King Louis Roman XII of France, an old, frail man with failing health. Imagine being her, full of life, passion, and spirit, walking into the icy stone corridors of a foreign court, surrounded by suspicious eyes and whispered rumors. One witness, a guard named Thomas, once told his son that the sound of Mary's laughter was the only warmth in that entire castle. But just 82 days after her wedding, King Louis was dead. Mary was a widow. More importantly, she was free. But freedom for a princess in the 16th century wasn't truly freedom. It was simply a brief pause in a game that had already been set in motion. The story of Mary Tudor might feel distant, but it brings us to a modern-day paradox, the Spencer family. When we hear the name Spencer, we think of wealth, respectability, and untarnished aristocracy. The Spencer family, for generations, was seen as a model of traditional British nobility. The name echoed through British high society, linked with refinement, stability, and grace. But this picture-perfect lineage, steeped in respectability, hides a much darker truth, one connected to the very bloodline of Mary Tudor. The Spencers are often hailed for their success and status, with ties to the monarchy that stretch back to the 14th century. But despite their outward appearance of prim and proper British nobility, the Spencer bloodline carries within it a legacy that traces back to a time of secrecy, rebellion, and royal betrayals. Deep within the Spencer tree, hidden behind generations of sheep farming, land ownership, and quiet respectability, runs the blood of a dynasty that was once feared and revered, the Tudors. The wealth, the titles, the sparkling family crest, these outward markers of success, were in some ways a carefully constructed facade. The Spencers built their fortune and reputation in ways that would seem unremarkable. But what they didn't know was that they were carrying the bones of an old and dangerous royal line in their veins. Beneath their polished surface lay the buried legacy of Mary Tudor, the forgotten sister of Henry Roman VIII. Her love, her defiance, her punishment. These were stories never meant to surface. But they had been passed down through generations, hidden in plain sight. And so, As we turn our attention to the Spencers, we are faced with a striking contradiction. A family who made their name by cultivating an image of stability, while unknowingly carrying a hidden connection to one of the most turbulent and tragic royal legacies in English history. To understand the gravity of the Spencer family's hidden history, we must first delve into the true story of the Tudors. The Tudor dynasty, a name synonymous with bloodshed, betrayal, and ruthless power, casts a long shadow over England's history. At the center of it all stands Henry Roman VIII, a king whose reign left a legacy of beheadings, broken vows, and a nation forever altered by his decisions. Henry Roman VIII, though often celebrated for his role in breaking away from the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England, is also known for the personal horrors that marked his reign. He beheaded two of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both women who had been lured into his dangerous web. He ordered the execution of Thomas More, his former friend and advisor, when More refused to accept his break with Rome. And yet, despite the bloodshed, Henry's reign is seen by many as a necessary chapter in English history, a story of revolution, change, and the forging of a new era. But beneath the royal pageantry, there existed a story of a family divided, torn apart by ambition and betrayal. The Tudors were not merely a royal family. They were a dynasty built on the back of ruthless power struggles. A family where loyalty was a currency and where blood, family blood, was spilled for the sake of preserving the crown. Henry's children, his wives, his closest allies, each became pawns in a game of power that would leave scars on the throne for generations. One of the most tragic figures in this blood-soaked tale was Mary Tudor, Henry Roman VIII's younger sister. Her story is one of love betrayed, of political manipulation, and of a woman whose beauty and ambition were ultimately overshadowed by the very dynasty she belonged to. Mary's life was never her own. It was always tied to the machinations of her brother, who viewed her not as a sister, but as a political tool. She was used to secure alliances, and when she was married off to King Louis Roman XII of France, she was nothing more than a pawn in Henry's quest for power. And yet, Mary's heart did not belong to the French king. Her heart belonged to Charles Brandon, a man who was not royal, but who held the key to Mary's heart, and perhaps to her fate. But in a world where loyalty to the crown was paramount, love could not survive without consequences. Mary Tudor's life was marked by a series of dramatic events that have largely been forgotten by history. While the likes of her brother, Henry Roman VIII, and his iconic wives dominated the annals of British history, Mary's story was pushed to the margins. And yet, her life was filled with complexities that would shape not only her destiny, but that of her descendants. Born into a time of intense political and religious turmoil, Mary was an attractive, intelligent woman who had the misfortune of being born into a family where political alliances were worth more than personal happiness. At just 18 years old, her life was about to be decided by her brother, Henry Roman VIII, in a marriage that would change the course of European history. Henry arranged for Mary to marry King Louis Roman XII of France, an elderly monarch whose health was already in decline. The political motivations behind this union were clear. Louis, though old, was a powerful ally, and the marriage would strengthen ties between England and France. But what was the true cost for Mary? She was sent to a foreign land, away from everything she had known, to marry a man who could have been her grandfather. The cold stone corridors of the French court, filled with whispers and political games, must have seemed a stark contrast to the warmth of her home in England. A girl full of life, passionate and vibrant, was now a young widow after just 82 days of marriage. Her husband, the frail King Louis, died soon after the wedding, leaving her free but also once again in the hands of the royal game. At this moment, Mary had a choice. She could have lived a quiet life, content in her widowhood, but instead she made a choice that would set her on a collision course with her brother Henry. A promise she had made years before, to marry for love, not for duty, was now within her grasp. And the man she had pledged her heart to was Charles Brandon, Henry's closest friend and confidante. Brandon was a man of low birth, yet he had earned Henry's favor. But his love for Mary was dangerous. To marry her without Henry's consent was to risk everything, including his life. And so, the promise Mary had made to Charles was a defiance of royal authority, one that could only end in disaster. After the death of King Louis Roman XII, Mary Tudor was left with an uncertain future. In the eyes of the court, she was a young widow with the power to solidify important political alliances. But Mary had already made up her mind. Her future would not be decided by political gain or the will of her brother. It would be decided by love. Her heart had always belonged to Charles Brandon, a man whom she had known and loved long before her marriage to the French king. Their love was genuine, filled with passion and a deep connection, but it was also forbidden. For Mary, the choice was clear. She would marry Charles, and if it meant defying her brother and all of England's royal expectations, then so be it. But what Mary didn't fully grasp was the magnitude of the risk she was about to take. Henry Roman VIII, ever the monarch consumed by control, could not bear the thought of his sister's marriage being anything other than a political maneuver designed to strengthen his own rule. Mary was not just his sister. She was a pawn in his endless game of European politics. She had already played her part in securing a crucial marriage to Louis Roman XII, and now she would play a different part, to continue making strategic alliances on Henry's terms. But Mary had a different plan. Before leaving England for France, she and Charles Brandon had secretly vowed that if fate made her a widow, she would choose her second husband herself, and that husband would be him. The promise was more than a sentimental declaration. It was a rebellion against the rigid structure of her royal life. It was her only chance at true happiness, and Mary was willing to risk everything for it. As the widow of Louis Roman XII, Mary was free once again, but freedom for a princess was never truly freedom. Her brother's influence stretched far and wide, and Mary knew that she could not remain unattached for long without his interference. When the news of Louis' death reached England, Henry quickly dispatched Charles Brandon to escort his sister back home. However, along with the orders to bring her back, an unspoken command was included: do not touch her. But for Charles, that command was impossible to obey. The very nature of his relationship with Mary meant that, for better or worse, he was already bound to her. Their love had flourished in secrecy, and now, Mary's widowhood seemed to give them the freedom they had always wanted. Yet even in the midst of grief, Charles had a duty to Henry, a duty that, as he knew all too well, was often a matter of life and death. As Charles sailed across the English Channel to bring Mary back, the weight of his loyalty to the king and his passion for the woman he loved pressed down on him. In his pocket, he carried a signet ring, a symbol of Henry's trust and his close friendship. The ring weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the promise he had made to the king and the vow he had made to Mary. But the choice was simple: love or loyalty. To choose Mary meant betraying his king, but to abandon her would mean the loss of everything he held dear. As the ship glided across the turbulent waves of the English Channel, Charles Brandon's mind was in turmoil. The salty sea air did little to clear the fog that clouded his thoughts. Every wave that crashed against the hull of the ship seemed to echo the pounding of his heart. He had been loyal to Henry Roman VIII for years, rising from the rank of a mere soldier to the king's most trusted companion. He had been granted titles, lands, and favor, all because of his unwavering loyalty to the crown. But now, that loyalty was being tested in ways he could never have imagined. The ship carried not just Mary Tudor's widowhood, but the weight of a choice that would forever alter his future. The unspoken command that had been handed to him along with his orders to escort Mary back to England had been clear: do not touch her. The subtlety of Henry's warning was lost on no one. It was a silent threat, one that suggested dire consequences should Charles and Mary's bond be discovered. But Charles knew what was truly at stake. The heavy gold signet ring Henry had pressed into Charles's hand before he set sail symbolized the king's faith in him. It was meant to be a sign of trust, a gesture that spoke to the close bond they shared. And yet, as the ship sailed closer to France's shores, that same ring began to feel like an anchor pulling him deeper into a sea of impossible choices. For Charles, there was no question of what he felt for Mary. He had loved her for years, long before the marriage to King Louis. Their connection was undeniable, their bond forged in quiet moments of shared glances, stolen words, and silent promises. But the moment their love had crossed into forbidden territory, everything had changed. Henry, for all his power, could not understand that kind of devotion. A devotion that did not bow to the king's will but instead rose against it. And yet, Charles knew that Mary's position, her royal blood, made her both precious and dangerous. To marry her without Henry's blessing was a death sentence. He had seen it before. Thomas More, a man who had refused to bow to the king's wishes, had paid the price with his life. Charles was no fool. He understood the stakes. When Charles finally arrived at the French court, the sight that met him was not one of joy or relief. Instead, he found Mary cloaked in mourning, her chambers draped in black velvet. The French court, which had once looked upon her with envy, now saw her as nothing more than a widow. Her beauty, her spirit, these had once been celebrated, but now they were muted by the sorrow of her lost husband. Yet, despite the solemnity of the moment, something passed between them as their eyes met. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the bond that had never truly been broken. But now, with her widowhood as a backdrop, it had become something more urgent, more defiant. That night, after dinner, Mary confronted Charles in the privacy of her chambers. She was no longer the shy girl she once was, timid in the shadow of her brother's demands. The years of being used as a pawn in her family's political games had forged her into something more. She was a woman who knew what she wanted, and she would stop at nothing to get it. "Will you marry me?" Mary asked, her voice no longer uncertain but strong, commanding. It wasn't a question, it was an ultimatum. Charles hesitated, and in that moment of silence, the weight of his loyalty to Henry, his king and friend, pressed down on him. He tried to warn her. He reminded her of the dangers, the risk of disobeying the king, the consequences they both knew too well. He spoke of the Tower of London, of executions, of the fate of men like Edmund Dapple, who had been put to death simply for being a distant threat to Henry's throne. But Mary would not bend. Her words were sharp, filled with the urgency of a woman who had already lost so much. "If you do not marry me now," she whispered fiercely, "you will take me back to England and I will be forced into another marriage. And I will make sure the king knows it was you who refused me. I will make him believe you broke his sister's heart." Her manipulation was brilliant, her strategy ruthless. She had trapped him between two dooms, the king's wrath if he married her, and the king's wrath if he abandoned her. There was no escape. And so, in a tiny chapel on the outskirts of Paris, with only a trembling old priest and a few frightened servants as witnesses, Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon defied the most powerful monarch in Europe. As Charles slid a borrowed ring onto Mary's finger, the chapel doors burst open with a gust of wind, snuffing out half the candles and plunging the room into shadows. The priest gasped at the omen, and in that moment the couple knew they were doomed. Their love had sealed their fate. The night air was thick with tension as Charles and Mary fled the chapel, their hearts racing in unison. The weight of their defiance hung heavily around them like an oppressive fog. They had just made an irreversible choice, a choice that would change the course of history, but one that had come with a price. The golden ring that had once symbolized the trust between Charles and Henry now seemed to mock him, burning a hole in his pocket as he walked beside Mary, his mind clouded with the reality of their decision. The forbidden marriage was an act of rebellion, and they both knew it. To marry without the king's consent was not only a personal betrayal but a public one. It was a challenge to the very foundation of Henry Roman VIII reign. And yet, in that dark chapel, surrounded by shadows and the cold whispers of destiny, Mary and Charles had chosen each other above all else. But the path they had chosen was not one that led to freedom. It was a path fraught with peril, leading straight back to England, where Henry awaited. As they embarked on the journey back to England, the silence between them was suffocating. Every creak of the ship's timbers felt like the turning of a wheel in a grim game of fate. Each wave crashing against the hull echoed like the ticking of a clock, counting down the moments until they would face the wrath of the king. Every letter they sent to Henry, every plea they wrote, every bargaining chip they offered seemed futile. Their marriage had already sealed their doom. Yet the couple could not help but hope that Henry's wrath would be softened by their pleas, that the king would see their love for what it was. Mary had reminded him of the bond they shared, the years of loyalty she had given him and the promises he had made. She wrote of her devotion to him, invoking the past and the love they had once shared. Charles, too, sent letters to Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's most trusted advisor, asking for mercy, begging for intervention. Their desperation was palpable, and yet the silence from the crown was deafening. When they finally landed in Dover, their hopes were dashed. There was no royal procession, no welcoming fanfare. The crowd that had gathered was a sea of stone faces, their eyes filled with contempt rather than admiration. Among the officials who greeted them was Sir Giles, a man whose fish-like eyes seemed to pierce through the very soul of Charles. Sir Giles refused to address Mary as Your Grace, and instead looked at Charles with pity and contempt. The message was clear. They were no longer friends of the crown, but traitors to it. The journey from Dover to London was one that would be forever etched in their memories. It was not a royal procession as they had hoped, but a slow, deliberate march toward their doom. Along the way, Mary and Charles were separated, each confined to their quarters, stripped of the titles and the respect they had once enjoyed. They were no longer nobility, no longer part of the royal family. Instead, they were prisoners, isolated from the world they had once known. At every stop along the way, servants who had once bowed deeply to them now averted their eyes, whispering behind their hands. The once grand halls that had been their homes were now empty, cold spaces where they were kept in seclusion. One night, a stable boy named Finn, who had once idolized Charles Brandon, slipped a note under their door. It wasn't words, but a crude drawing. The Tower of London, two figures standing on the scaffold. The message was unmistakable. Death awaited them. By the time they reached London, the entire city was abuzz with the news of their secret marriage. But there was no crowd waiting to greet them, no cheers of welcome, no cries of outrage. There was only silence. The streets were empty, save for a few officials who ushered them toward their fate. And at the heart of this silence was Henry Roman VIII, angrier than he had ever been, consumed not just by the defiance of his sister and his closest companion, but by a deep, personal betrayal. The gates of the Tower of London loomed ahead, their jagged silhouette cutting through the fog like the blade of an executioner's axe. The journey from Dover had been long, silent, and full of dread. Mary and Charles, once powerful figures in the court, now found themselves reduced to prisoners, their every movement under watchful eyes. The cold reception they received upon arrival in London was a far cry from the royal welcome they had once envisioned. There were no banners flying in their honor, no royal procession to mark their return, only the steady, implacable march toward an uncertain fate. They were escorted through the streets in the dead of night, their faces hidden, their eyes downcast. The officials who greeted them barely met their gazes, and whispers of their defiance spread like wildfire. Their marriage, once a beautiful act of love and rebellion, was now seen as a political blunder of monumental proportions. The scandal was not just personal, it was a blow to the crown itself. In Henry's eyes, this was not merely a betrayal of a king, but a personal affront to his authority, a challenge to the power he held over his sister and his closest confidante. As Mary and Charles were ushered into the confines of the royal palace, the magnitude of their mistake became more apparent with each passing moment. They were not treated as royals as they once had been. Instead, they were confined to separate quarters, locked away from each other, isolated in a way that magnified the weight of their punishment. Henry had chosen this path. He wanted fear to eat away at them from the inside out. He wanted them to suffer not from the threat of execution, but from the slow, grinding anguish of isolation and humiliation. Charles was led to a small, stark room, his new home now a barren stone chamber with no view, no warmth, and no comfort. From his small barred window, he could see nothing but a blank wall, a metaphor for the life he now found himself trapped in. The man who had once been the king's closest friend now had nothing, his world reduced to four walls and the bitter taste of regret. Mary, on the other hand, was given a more luxurious room, but it was no less a prison. The doors were locked from the outside, and though the room was filled with fine furniture and food, it was all meaningless. The walls of her gilded cage were no less confining than those of Charles's stone cell. There was no comfort in this luxury, no escape from the suffocating reality of their situation. The court that had once admired Mary's beauty and strength now avoided her gaze, whispering about her scandalous marriage and the wrath of Henry Roman VIII. And still, they waited. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The silence of their confinement became a living thing, pressing down on them, filling the spaces between their thoughts with dread. Mary wrote letters to Henry, begging for mercy, reminding him of the promises he had made to her. Charles sent messages to Cardinal Wolsey, pleading for intervention, offering jewels and money to buy their way out of the king's wrath. But all their pleas were met with the same answer: silence. It was only when the summons came that the true extent of their punishment began to sink in. Charles was called to meet Henry, but not in the grand throne room, not in front of the court as he might have expected. Instead, he was summoned to a small, private study at Greenwich Palace, a room far removed from the court's usual splendor. As Charles entered, he saw Henry sitting behind a massive oak desk, calmly cleaning his fingernails with a dagger. There was no rage in Henry's eyes, no shouting, no fury. Instead, there was a coldness, a detached calculation that cut deeper than any anger could. The king's voice was low, almost casual as he spoke, making it clear that this was not a trial, but a moment of judgment. "Charles, my friend," Henry said almost mockingly, "the man I raised from nothing. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Charles stood in silence, his knees weak beneath him. The cold, methodical tone of Henry's words made him realize the full depth of the trap he had walked into. The king's gaze was piercing, and Charles could feel the weight of his words settling on him like a stone. "You know the law," Henry continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "To marry my sister without my consent is treason, and the punishment for treason is death. The headsman sharpens his axe every morning. Sometimes he even asks his wife, 'Who will it be today, I wonder?'" The words hung in the air like a noose, but Henry didn't move. He let the silence stretch out, as though savoring the discomfort he was inflicting. Charles could barely breathe. The man he had once considered a friend was now his judge, his executioner. The punishment for defying the king's authority was clear, and yet Henry was not interested in ending Charles's life. Instead, he would make him suffer in a different way. Henry leaned forward, still holding the dagger, his eyes narrowing. "Your head is worth less to me on a spike than your life is in my debt. I will let you live, but know this: you have taken my sister, you have taken my authority, and you have made a fool of me before all of Europe. That, Charles, I will never forgive." The room fell into a suffocating silence as Henry's words cut through the air. Charles stood there, caught between the man he had once called a friend and the brutal reality of the king's fury. Every word Henry spoke seemed designed not only to break him, but to strip away every ounce of dignity and hope. Charles had crossed a line, one that could not be undone, and now he was paying the price. But Henry's punishment was not as simple as the execution Charles feared. Henry had no intention of ending his life swiftly with a quick stroke of the axe. Instead, the king had devised a punishment far more torturous, a punishment that would leave Charles alive but broken, humiliated, and chained to a life of servitude. "You have not only taken my sister, Charles," Henry continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have taken my authority. You have made me a fool before all of Europe, and that I will never forgive." The king's words were calculated, each one designed to drive the knife of betrayal deeper into Charles's soul. But Henry was not done. He had devised a series of punishments, each one a cruel reminder of who held power. "The first," Henry said, "is money. You and Mary will repay every penny of her French dowry. You will sign over the income from your estates. You will be nobility in name only, but beggars in reality, It was a financial ruin so complete that it would strip them of all their wealth and status, reducing them to commoners in everything but title. But that was not the worst of it. Second, Henry's voice turned even colder, is humiliation. You will marry Mary again publicly in front of the entire court. You will kneel before me and you will beg for forgiveness. The king's eyes locked onto Charles's, and in that moment, Charles realized that his love for Mary, his defiance of Henry, would never be remembered as an act of passion or rebellion. Instead, it would be viewed as submission, a forced act of penitence. Henry intended to strip them of their dignity in front of the entire court to make their love story a spectacle of shame. But there is one final condition, Henry said, his words sharp as a blade. Your children, Charles, will live because I allow it, but they will carry no claim, no royal title. They will be watched, controlled, and most importantly, they will know that they are nothing more than pawns in my game. The final blow fell with chilling precision. Henry had not only destroyed Charles and Mary's lives, but had ensured that their descendants would never escape the shadow of his wrath. The Tudor bloodline that Mary carried, which had once been a symbol of power and nobility, was now nothing more than a curse. Charles left Henry's study that day a broken man. He had walked in fearing death, but instead he walked out condemned to something far worse, a life of servitude stripped of his honor and tethered to the whims of the man who had once been his closest friend. As he exited the study, the weight of Henry's punishment pressed down on him like a heavy shroud. In the days that followed, Mary and Charles's world collapsed. The promises of love and loyalty that had once fueled their secret marriage now seemed like distant memories, drowned by the overwhelming consequences of their actions. Their defiance had been answered not with the sharp swing of an axe, but with a slow, methodical dismantling of everything they had once known. The first of Henry's punishments, the financial ruin, unfolded swiftly. Their estates, once flourishing under their stewardship, were stripped from them. The once proud couple found themselves reduced to the status of paupers, bound by legal documents that emptied their coffers and left them with nothing but their titles, which had become mere symbols of a dignity long lost. The lands they had inherited, the wealth they had cultivated, were now in the hands of the crown. But the financial blow was the least of their suffering. The true weight of Henry's punishment was felt in the isolation that followed. Charles and Mary were not just stripped of their possessions, they were stripped of their place in the world. They were no longer royal figures, no longer part of the court. Instead, they were exiled to a life of humiliation, forced to live out their days under the watchful eyes of the king's spies. Their once grand home became a gilded cage. Westhorpe Hall, their family seat, stood as a testament to their fall from grace. The house, beautiful as it was, could no longer be a sanctuary. It was filled with the constant reminder of the price they had paid. The servants who had once bowed to them now averted their eyes, and their interactions with the outside world were heavily restricted. Every word, every glance, every action was watched. They were prisoners, not just of their own making, but of the king's will. The king's spies were everywhere, planted among their staff and in the very walls of their home. Master Croft, the steward of Westhorpe, appeared to be a loyal servant, but in truth, he was the king's informant. Every fortnight, he would send detailed reports to London, keeping Henry informed of every move they made. There was no escape from this constant surveillance, no privacy in their own home. Their children, the descendants of this forbidden union, grew up under the weight of a legacy they could neither escape nor embrace. They were the granddaughters of a king, the nieces of a queen, yet they were forbidden to speak of it. The royal blood that ran through their veins was a curse, not a blessing. They carried the stigma of their parents' rebellion, the shame of a love that had defied the very crown. Frances, the eldest of their daughters, inherited her mother's fire. She was strong-willed, unafraid, and proud of her lineage. But like her mother, she was trapped by the constraints of royal politics. Her marriage was arranged not for love, but to strengthen political alliances. Frances, like her mother before her, found herself caught in a world where duty and obligation eclipsed personal happiness. Her marriage to Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, was respectable, but it was a cage of silk bars. Mary and Charles watched, helpless, as their children's futures were dictated by the same forces that had torn apart their own lives. They had fought for love, for freedom, but in the end, they had only passed their suffering on to their children, and the pain of that reality was more than they could bear. Despite the heavy chains of servitude and humiliation that Mary and Charles endured, their children's futures were equally tragic, woven into the tapestry of the Tudor bloodline. Their daughters, Frances and Eleanor, were born into a world where their lineage, once a source of immense power, was now a curse. The very blood that had run through the veins of kings and queens was now something to be hidden, something that the monarchy could not afford to see flourish. As Frances came of age, it became clear that she carried more than just her mother's fiery spirit. She was a reminder of the forbidden love that had defied the crown. But in the world of royal politics, there was no room for rebellion, especially not from someone of Frances's blood. The Tudor name, now tainted by the scandal of Mary and Charles's secret marriage, was viewed with suspicion, and it wasn't long before her future was carefully controlled by those who had the most to gain from it: the crown. Frances's marriage to Henry Grey, the Marquis of Dorset, was arranged by the king himself. The match was respectable, yes, but it was devoid of love and passion. It was a strategic union, one meant to maintain the illusion of stability, to keep the Tudor bloodline in check without allowing it to rise again. Frances was, in many ways, a pawn in the same game her mother had once played, though this time, it was not a game she could win. Her marriage was part of the crown's intricate web of control, a web that sought to eliminate any threat posed by the remnants of the Tudor dynasty. Mary and Charles, now silent witnesses to their children's fates, could only watch as history repeated itself. Their defiance had cost them their freedom, their dignity, and now it seemed to be exacting its toll on the next generation as well. But their suffering did not end with Frances. Their other daughter, Eleanor, too, found herself trapped by the same forces that had ensnared her family. Although not as prominent as her older sister, Eleanor was nonetheless caught in the web of royal control. The Tudor blood that coursed through her veins marked her, even if she had no desire for the throne. The pressure to conform, to accept the fate handed down to her, was suffocating. Like her mother and sister, she was made to play a role she had never chosen. The fate of the Brandon Tudor daughters was a grim reminder of the high price of defying the king. Love, rebellion, and defiance had led to their family's downfall, and now the consequences were being passed down like a curse, affecting generations to come. While Frances and Eleanor's lives were tightly controlled, the story of their cousin, Lady Jane Grey, took a far more tragic turn. Jane, the granddaughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, became the embodiment of a royal bloodline caught between conflicting ambitions. Her life, like her mother's before her, was shaped by the cruel machinations of power. At the tender age of 16, Jane had no desire to rule. She was a bookish girl, more interested in her studies than in matters of the crown. She longed for a quiet life, one spent with her books and her dreams. But Jane's royal blood, particularly her descent from the Tudors, made her a pawn in the deadly political games of the time. The Protestant faction, desperate for a monarch they could control, saw Jane as the perfect alternative to Queen Mary I, the Catholic daughter of Henry Roman VIII. Jane's rise to the throne was not the result of her own ambition, but rather the ambitions of the men around her. Her parents, along with the Duke of Northumberland, made a political deal that placed Jane at the center of a dangerous power struggle. When the sickly young King Edward VI died in 1553, Jane was declared queen, despite the fact that her claim was tenuous at best. She was crowned Queen of England in a hasty ceremony, with no enthusiasm from the public and only the cold approval of the lords who had orchestrated her rise. But the crown was not hers for long. The public, fiercely loyal to the rightful heir, Queen Mary I, did not rally behind Jane. Within days, Mary's forces gathered strength, and Jane's brief reign crumbled. Just 9 days after her coronation, Jane was deposed. Her ambition, or rather, the ambition imposed upon her, had been crushed by the weight of the monarchy's historical power. In the midst of her downfall, Jane remained resolute, but she was terrified. She had been used as a pawn, and now her fate was sealed. Her parents and supporters abandoned her, leaving Jane to face the consequences alone. As her time as queen came to an end, Jane was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Her trial was swift and unforgiving. Mary, now queen, was determined to punish those who had conspired against her, and Jane, despite her innocence in the larger political scheme, was sentenced to death. On the day of her execution, Jane, calm and dignified, walked to the scaffold. But in one of the final cruel twists of fate, she was led to the block and asked to find it in the dark, blindfolded. Her moment of confusion was recorded by witnesses, a final reflection of the tragic fate of a girl who had never asked for power, yet had been thrust into a world where power was everything. As the blade fell, it was the final act in a family saga marked by sacrifice, betrayal, and loss. Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was no more, but her death, a tragic end to the hope of a bloodline that had once been royal, was only the beginning of a continuing legacy of the Tudor curse. The bloodline that Henry Roman VIII had sought to erase had not only survived but was now sealed in the final, tragic fate of Jane. Lady Jane Grey's execution, though swift, was one of the most poignant moments in the saga of the Tudor bloodline. Her death marked the culmination of Henry Roman VIII's long-held desire to extinguish the Tudor legacy that had defied him so many years ago. In the years since the secret marriage of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, the monarchy had fought to suppress the remnants of that rebellious bloodline, and Jane was the final casualty of this cruel, calculated vengeance. The execution of Jane, a 16-year-old girl who had never wanted the throne, was a brutal and symbolic act. She was led to the scaffold in the Tower of London, a place where so many others had met their ends, their blood mingling with the cobblestones beneath. Jane's last moments were filled with fear, but also with a dignity that only a royal could possess in the face of certain death. When asked to kneel, She did so without hesitation, her eyes steady despite the terror that must have gripped her heart. As she was blindfolded, Jane reached for the execution block, her hands trembling. In one last, human moment of confusion, she fumbled for the place where she would lay her neck and prepare for death. This brief moment of vulnerability was a stark reminder that Jane, despite her royal blood and her political role, was ultimately just a young girl caught in the web of royal power. She had been used, manipulated, and betrayed by those who had placed her on the throne, and now she was paying the ultimate price. The blade fell, and with it, the last hope for the Tudor bloodline to rise again. Jane's death was the final act of vengeance in a long history of royal conflict, and it felt as though the curse that had begun with Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon had come full circle. The Tudor dynasty, which had once seemed so invincible, was now fractured, its bloodline snuffed out in the cold shadow of the tower. But Jane's death did not erase the bloodline. Her sisters, Catherine and Mary, who were still alive, carried the same dangerous inheritance, and their fates would also be marked by the weight of their royal heritage. The tragedy of Lady Jane Grey's death was not the final chapter in the story of the Tudor bloodline. While Jane's reign lasted only 9 days, the ripple effects of her death reached deep into the next generation, touching her sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey. They too carried the dangerous inheritance of their royal Tudor blood, a legacy that would never let them live in peace. Catherine, the eldest of the 2 surviving sisters, was everything her sister Jane was not. While Jane was studious, calm, and withdrawn, Catherine was vivacious, charming, and known for her beauty. But these qualities, which might have been assets in another time, became a source of danger under the paranoid rule of Queen Elizabeth I. The Queen, who had never married and refused to name an heir, was terrified of any potential rival to her throne, especially one with the royal blood of the Tudors. Catherine's beauty and high birth made her a political pawn in Elizabeth's court, and the threat she posed to the Queen became evident when Catherine fell in love with Edward Seymour, a man of noble birth but no royal title. They married in secret, hoping to escape the watchful eye of the Queen. But their secret marriage soon became impossible to hide, and Elizabeth, ever fearful of anyone who could potentially challenge her reign, unleashed her fury upon Catherine. Elizabeth did not have Catherine executed, as she had with others who had defied her, but she punished her in a way far crueler. She declared Catherine's marriage to Seymour invalid, labeling her children illegitimate. Catherine was imprisoned, moved from one desolate castle to another, her life reduced to a series of dreary, isolated places. She was never allowed to see her husband again, and the love that had once filled her heart turned to anguish and despair. Over the course of several years, Catherine wasted away. Her body grew frail, and her spirit was broken. She died at the age of just 27, officially from illness, but it was clear to those around her that her death was as much from heartbreak as from any physical malady. Mary, the youngest of the Grey sisters, had a far different fate, but it was no less tragic. Mary was born with dwarfism and a crooked spine, and while this made her a figure of mockery in the court, she was still a potential threat to the throne. Though she was considered harmless by most, her royal blood remained a dangerous legacy. Like her sisters before her, Mary was caught in the web of royal politics, and when she married beneath her station, choosing the Queen's Sergeant Porter, a man of far lower rank, Elizabeth's fury was reignited. Mary, like Catherine, was imprisoned by the Queen. For years, she was kept under house arrest, separated from her husband, and her life was nothing more than a shadow of what it could have been. The Tudor bloodline, once so proud and powerful, had been reduced to a series of tragic lives marked by imprisonment, secrecy, and loss. Mary died in obscurity, her name forgotten by most. She, too, had borne the weight of the Tudor curse, an inheritance of both power and tragedy that would never allow her to live a life of peace or freedom. The tragic fates of Catherine and Mary were a cruel reminder of the far-reaching consequences of defying the monarchy. The Tudor bloodline, though once a symbol of strength and royal might, had been twisted into a symbol of shame, suffering, and repression. The curse that began with Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon's forbidden love had reached its full expression in the lives of their descendants, who were doomed to live under the shadow of the throne, unable to escape the legacy of their family's defiance. Centuries passed, and the great Tudor name faded into history, buried beneath the weight of its tragic legacy. The Stuart dynasty rose, followed by the Hanoverians, and with them came a new chapter of British monarchy. The bloodline of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon seemed to have disappeared, lost to time, their rebellious spirit forever quelled. But as history often reveals, bloodlines have a way of resurfacing when least expected. By the 20th century, the name Spencer had come to symbolize wealth, respectability, and tradition. The Spencer family had evolved from humble beginnings into one of Britain's most prominent aristocratic families, known for their estates, their landholdings, and their long line of stable, upper-class English nobility. The Spencers had no royal titles, no grand claims to the throne, but hidden deep in their lineage was the blood of Mary Tudor, a connection that had been forgotten by many, but not by all. In 1961, a quiet, unassuming woman named Diana Frances Spencer was born into this family. She was the daughter of John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, and his wife Frances. Diana's childhood was far removed from the royal intrigue and the blood-soaked legacy of the Tudors. She grew up on the family estate, in the relative anonymity that came with being the daughter of an aristocrat, rather than the grandchild of a monarch. Diana was a shy, gentle girl with an almost ethereal quality about her. She did not seek fame or power, but as fate would have it, the world would soon come to know her name. Her connection to the royal family began when she married Prince Charles, the heir to the British throne, in a wedding watched by millions around the world. The fairy tale had arrived, the commoner marrying the prince. Yet beneath this romantic image lay a far deeper, more dramatic history. Diana's middle name, Frances, was no coincidence. It was passed down from her ancestor, Frances Brandon, the daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. This small detail, overlooked by many, linked Diana directly to the bloodline that Henry Roman VIII had tried so desperately to erase. Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was not just the joining of two people. It was the merging of two families with far more than history in common. Through Diana, the legacy of Mary Tudor, the girl who chose love over duty and defied her brother, had returned to the royal line. While the public saw Diana as the people's princess, loved for her compassion and her beauty, there was a deeper story behind her. Diana was not just a symbol of grace and kindness. She was the living testament to a bloodline that had defied kings, that had been humiliated, imprisoned, and cast aside for centuries. Her very existence, her very blood, was a direct challenge to the monarchies that had once sought to suppress her ancestors. The blood of Mary Tudor, so long buried, had found its way back into the heart of the British monarchy through the most unlikely of women. When Diana gave birth to her sons, William and Harry, it was as if history itself had come full circle. The sons of a woman who carried the forbidden bloodline of Mary Tudor were now heirs to the British throne. Prince William, now the heir apparent, carries with him the legacy of a dynasty that had been buried, forgotten, and buried again. Yet, despite the efforts of many to erase the Tudors from history, their bloodline endured. It rose again in the very heart of the monarchy, carried through Diana and passed down to her sons. Through Prince William, the blood of Mary Tudor now rests at the very center of the British royal family, a living symbol of defiance, tragedy, and the cyclical nature of history. The royal bloodline that Henry Roman VIII had once sought to extinguish is now woven into the fabric of the monarchy once more, a reminder that no matter how deeply a family's history is buried, it can never truly be erased. Diana's legacy is more than that of a princess who captured the hearts of millions. She was a woman who embodied the very spirit of the Tudor bloodline, resilient, rebellious, and ultimately, a reminder that history is never truly gone. It simply waits, sometimes for centuries, until the right moment for it to rise again. And with her sons, Diana brought that legacy back into the royal fold. The story of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon's forbidden love, which began in a small chapel in France more than 5 centuries ago, did not end in tragedy. It did not end with the execution of Jane Grey, or the death of Catherine or Mary Grey, or the quiet obscurity of their descendants. No, it found its true continuation in the eyes of Prince William, the future king. The blood that Henry Roman VIII tried to destroy, the love that defied his throne, had come back to sit once more upon the British crown. History, after all, is rarely linear. It twists and turns, and often circles back on itself in the most unexpected of ways. For Diana, for her children, and for the future of the monarchy, the Tudor story did not end. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to rise again. As Princess Diana stood before the world, her beauty, kindness, and grace made her one of the most beloved figures of her time. Her marriage to Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, was heralded as a fairy tale. The public adored her, and she quickly became a symbol of compassion, a beacon of hope for the common people. Her charity work, especially her involvement with AIDS patients and landmine victims, cemented her place in history as a princess who used her position to make a difference in the world. Yet, beneath the surface of her outwardly perfect life, there lay a deeper, more profound story that few understood. Diana, as the modern face of the royal family, was inextricably linked to a bloodline that had once been suppressed, mocked, and erased from the royal narrative. Her marriage to Prince Charles was not merely the union of 2 people. It was the convergence of centuries of royal history, a history that began with a forbidden love and a royal rebellion. The story of Diana's family, buried in the past and entwined with the lives of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, emerged from the shadows in the most ironic way. Diana, who was often seen as the ultimate commoner turned princess, was unknowingly carrying the blood of one of the most dramatic and defiant lines in English history. The very blood that Henry Roman VIII had sought to stamp out had returned to the heart of the British monarchy. The Tudor story was one of defiance against the crown. From Mary Tudor's secret marriage to Charles Brandon, to the tragic fates of Lady Jane Grey and her sisters, the Tudor bloodline had been shaped by love, rebellion, and sacrifice. The line had been humiliated, forced into silence, and even erased from the official record, yet it had never truly died. Instead, it waited, buried beneath layers of history, until the right moment for it to resurface. That moment came with Diana. When Diana gave birth to her children, particularly Prince William, the legacy of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon was resurrected in a most unexpected way. Prince William, now the heir apparent to the British throne, carried the blood of a family once deemed unfit for power. The bloodline that Henry Roman VIII had feared, the bloodline that had defied his authority and paid the ultimate price for it, was now the lineage of the future king. Diana's life, full of both triumph and tragedy, mirrored the struggles of her Tudor ancestors. Her marriage to Prince Charles, fraught with tension and public scrutiny, was a reflection of the tortured relationships that had marked the Tudor dynasty. Her children, raised in the shadow of their royal status, carried not only the hopes of a modern nation, but also the weight of a bloodline that had been part of England's most tumultuous and complicated royal history. As the years passed and Diana's legacy continued to unfold, her sons, particularly Prince William, became the living embodiment of a bloodline that had survived centuries of suppression. The curse that had begun with Mary Tudor's defiance of her brother, Henry Roman VIII, had not been broken by death or imprisonment. It had, in fact, been woven back into the very fabric of the British monarchy. Through Diana, the Tudor bloodline had returned to the throne, not as a threat, but as a legitimate heir to the crown. What was once seen as a dark and rebellious history now sat in the very heart of the monarchy, with Prince William set to inherit the throne. The irony of this situation was not lost on anyone who understood the history of the Tudors. The blood that had been exiled, erased, and demonized for so many years was now poised to rule once again. Diana, the princess who had captured the world's heart, had brought the long-buried legacy of Mary Tudor back to where it had once been lost forever. Diana was more than just a fairy tale princess. She was the symbol of a bloodline that refused to fade away. Her son, William, is the future king, carrying the weight of a legacy that defied the crown, a legacy that had been silenced for generations. And in that irony, we see a truth about history. It does not simply fade into the past. It waits, silently and patiently, for the right moment to reappear, often in the most unexpected of ways. As Prince William stands at the threshold of his future as the next King of England, the weight of his lineage presses heavily on him, more so than he or anyone could have imagined. His connection to the British throne is not just one of royal blood and public expectation, but also a deeper, more complex legacy that dates back over 5 centuries. The bloodline that runs through William's veins is not only that of the Windsors, but of the Tudors, a line that was nearly obliterated by Henry Roman VIII himself. The revelation of William's Tudor connection is an irony that could not be more fitting. Here stands a man who will one day ascend to the throne of the United Kingdom, and in his veins flows the very blood that once threatened the crown. It was Henry Roman VIII who sought to destroy the Tudor legacy through brutal political maneuvers, forcing his sister Mary into a marriage she didn't choose, condemning her to a life of political exile and humiliation. Yet, despite his efforts, The bloodline he tried to erase found its way back into the heart of the British monarchy. For William, the recognition of his Tudor ancestry is a powerful reminder of the resilience of royal bloodlines. The Tudors were a family built on defiance, love, and tragedy. From Mary Tudor's forbidden marriage to Charles Brandon, to the executions of Lady Jane Grey and the fate of her sisters, the Tudor family had paid a heavy price for their audacity to challenge the monarchy. Their story was one of resistance to the forces of royal power, and yet, through sheer will and endurance, their bloodline survived, ultimately finding its place again, not as an outsider but as a legitimate heir to the throne. Prince William's position as heir is not just a reflection of his place in the current royal family. It is a continuation of a history that had been buried, lost, and then rediscovered in the most unexpected way. The irony of his Tudor heritage is not lost on him or on the public. As he takes on the mantle of future king, he carries with him the legacy of a dynasty that defied royal expectations and ultimately returned to claim its place in history. As he prepares for the day when he will ascend to the throne, William stands not only as the heir to the Windsors, but as a symbol of a bloodline that transcends the political and personal battles of the past. His Tudor connection, once a curse, has become a testament to the enduring power of family and history. It is a reminder that, no matter how hard the crown tries to erase or suppress, the blood of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon can never truly be destroyed. It lives on in Prince William, and through him, the Tudor legacy will continue to shape the future of the British monarchy. His reign will mark the return of the bloodline that Henry Roman VIII sought to silence, a bloodline that now sits at the pinnacle of the monarchy, as he inherits not only the throne but the responsibility of carrying the weight of his ancestors' choices. William's story will be one of redemption, not just for him, but for the entire Tudor lineage that has waited so long for its rightful place in history. The story of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, of defiance, love, and punishment, did not end with their tragic fates or with the death of Lady Jane Grey. It was merely suspended in time, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. That moment has come, and through Prince William, the Tudor legacy will once again find its place on the throne, a powerful reminder that history, no matter how dark or buried, has a way of coming full circle. The saga of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon's forbidden love has long been overshadowed by the towering figures of the Tudor dynasty. The history of their defiance against Henry Roman VIII, their suffering, and the harsh punishments they endured seem to fade into the shadows of time. Their story, marked by the execution of Lady Jane Grey and the isolation of their descendants, was often viewed as a tragic footnote in the larger narrative of royal history. Yet, as we have seen, their bloodline refused to be erased, and after centuries of being suppressed, it found its way back to the heart of the British monarchy. Through Princess Diana, the once forgotten bloodline of Mary Tudor re-entered the royal fold, not as a threat, but as a legitimate force that would carry the weight of history in a new generation. Diana's marriage to Prince Charles, though filled with personal challenges, unknowingly revived the very legacy that had once been rejected. And through her children, especially Prince William, the Tudor bloodline that had defied kings and queens alike returned to its rightful place. As Prince William prepares to inherit the throne, his reign will not only be a continuation of the Windsor legacy, but also a reflection of the perseverance and resilience of the Tudor line. His very existence, as the heir to the throne, carries within it the story of a family that endured years of humiliation, defiance, and tragedy. The legacy of Mary Tudor's love for Charles Brandon, once deemed forbidden and dangerous, now stands as a testament to the enduring power of love, defiance, and blood. The crown, long held by the Windsors, will one day rest on William's head, but in that moment the crown will not only belong to the royal family, it will carry the weight of a far deeper history. It will be a crown born of love, rebellion, and survival. The Tudor bloodline, once nearly erased, will return to its rightful place at the throne, a powerful reminder that no matter how hard history may try to bury the past, it has a way of rising again. This is not just the story of Princess Diana or Prince William. It is the story of an enduring family legacy, of the choices made long ago by Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, whose love defied a king and whose descendants would one day return to sit on the throne. It is a reminder that history is rarely linear. It is cyclical. The past is never truly gone. It simply waits for the right moment to return, to reclaim what was once taken, and to remind us that the bloodlines of kings and queens carry stories that never truly fade. In the eyes of Prince William, we see not only the future of the British monarchy, but the continuation of a legacy that was never truly lost. The story of the Tudors, of their rebellion and their love, lives on in him, in his children, and in the royal family that has witnessed the return of a bloodline once deemed cursed. History may try to erase it, but the Tudors, in all their defiance, will never be forgotten.